From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. With all the excitement about the COVID vaccine arriving at the end of last year, news about another scientific breakthrough got lost in the shuffle. In late 2020, Singapore made history, becoming the first country in the world to authorize the sale of cultured meat. Or, to put it simply, it's meat grown in a lab. If the thought of that makes you a little queasy, you're not alone. But the companies in the lab-grown meat industry are asking some big questions. What if you could eat meat without killing an animal? Livestock makes up 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Does consuming less meat cut down on our carbon footprint? To talk about lab-grown meat and when it might end up on your plate, Matt Simon, science reporter for Wired magazine. He's reported on the lab-grown meat industry and has interviewed the US company that got the approval to sell it. So, lab-grown meat, what is it? And will it change the way we eat forever? Hey Matt, it's good to talk to you.
And thanks for having me.
Matt, I wanted to start off with the basics because for a lot of us, this is brand new territory. So let's define what it is exactly we are talking about. It goes by different names: cultured meat, lab-grown meat. What exactly is it?
It's interesting that you call it by those names because this is actually a point of some contention in the industry. We're talking about really a brand new kind of food. It is grown in the lab. It's cultured meat technically as well. So very basically, it's about really kind of replicating the natural process for how our meat is grown out in the fields in a chicken or a cow or a pig. So you take a couple of muscle cells from these animals and bring it into the lab, and then you feed it the requisite nutrients and get it to be the right temperature, that sort of thing. And what you can do is actually get these cells to proliferate. And then they become meat. The challenge there is that where the industry is right now is really growing kind of mush. So think of like chorizo or sausage or, recently the chicken nugget. It's not very well structured meat. What is probably a very far ways off is something like a steak, which has a really intricate 3D structure. But for now, lab-grown meat, culture meat, whatever you want to call it, it is officially here.
So in the way that it's made, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's almost like tricking these cells into believing that they are inside of an animal or how mammals grow. Basically, you're recreating that meat by tricking the cells. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. And so what you have seen in this very nascent industry, and folks are trying to do it for fish as well as things like pigs and cows and chickens. So what you have typically done so far is you feed it something called a serum. And this is packed with all kinds of nutrients that would be very difficult to replicate just bit by bit in the lab. The problem is that that's extracted from animals, and it is very, very expensive, whether it's for fish or chicken. So what these companies are now working toward is kind of re-engineering, as you had mentioned, that way to grow these cells like they were in an animal without the serum. That's going to be the big breakthrough because, really, if we're talking about the cruelty-free side of this, which is growing, just a couple of cells taken from an animal in the lab, you don't want that serum to be part of it, on top of it being extremely expensive. And we have to bring the price down for this sort of food.
You used a really good analogy in explaining how this serum works, and I think a lot of people, especially in quarantine, might be able to relate to it. You called it almost a starter yeast that we would use for sourdough bread. Basically, you need some of that initial material to let it grow into something else.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And again, this is packed with all kinds of nutrients that the cells would be getting in an animal. So it is a lot like baking bread on an extremely technical scale. There's companies spending an enormous amount of money on this to replicate all this in the lab. And again, you have to have the right temperature, that sort of thing as well. So it's extremely delicate. And I'm glad that all these folks are baking during quarantine. But I'm sorry to say that you have nothing on what these companies are trying to do with these serums in particular. But again, the idea is to get past that serum, to somehow replicate just this bevy of different nutrients that these cells actually need to grow into something that we might be able to eat.
So that brings us to today. Singapore is the first country in the world to approve lab-grown meat for its market. Back in 2018, you reported on this company called Eat Just that would win this latest approval.
One of the biggest points of comparison between what we're doing and the old way of doing things is food safety. And when you make that comparison, the difference is staggering.
What's your reaction to lab-grown meat finally making it to market?
I think there's some really interesting questions here. I don't at all doubt the safety. It was approved for a reason, but there's some interesting philosophical questions here. So, as you had mentioned earlier, that there's a couple of different names for this. And so that's coming down to a large degree because these companies don't really want you to eat something called lab-grown meat. It's not great marketing.
It's not appetizing.
It's not, no. So there's this weird bickering in the industry about what you want to call it. But that also comes back to the regulators. How do regulators see this as, a consumable food? So a lot of folks have been, maybe trying to use euphemisms, which might hide the fact that this is a particular kind of meat. So like you want, say, a fish that's grown in a lab to be labeled as fish because it is in fact fish grown from fish muscles because of people with allergies, right? So you can't skirt around the terminology very much because there are ways that people can get hurt if they're eating something that, they think it's maybe imitation fish and it's worded in such a way where it is actually in fact grown in a lab from fish cells and could cause an allergic reaction. So there's these really interesting regulatory questions that it's safe to say that these regulatory bodies have not come across before.
We've seen this almost in how plant-based meat has become a big discussion point for people in the agriculture industry. I believe in the US, there are lobbyists that say, Beyond Meat or Impossible Meat, they shouldn't be called meat because it's something else entirely. And it kind of gets back to, well, what is meat? What is milk? We have milk that is from soybeans and from almonds, right? So it almost becomes that language is a fight in itself.
It is. And yeah, you're seeing this, as you mentioned, in alternatives like the Impossible Burger, which has its own ingredients that might cause allergic reactions. It has soy in it, so it has to be labeled as such. You can't just call it, hey, it's just imitation meat without being more specific about it. The fact of the matter is that this is a steady march in the direction of meat alternatives, be it the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger, or very soon, probably that we'll see in the United States, these cultured meats or lab-grown meats. It's the inevitable march of progress because there is, I think, a lot at stake when it comes to, cruelty-free food. But also when it comes to climate change, growing cows and pigs and chickens in the field, that creates a lot of emissions on top of having to ship all those meats everywhere. The promise here with any of these alternatives is you could have factories producing them in different cities and cut down on shipping costs.
So is that the biggest, I suppose, argument for culture meat or lab-grown meat or however you want to call it? Is that how these companies and food scientists are selling it, that it is based around fighting back against climate change and for animal welfare? Are those the main arguments for them?
It is, and it's about scale, right? So you can't very easily scale up meat production without taking up more land where we should be planting trees and things like that instead. So the idea here is, you create these factories, you dot them across a country, you cut down on shipping costs, you cut down on the emissions that come from that shipping. It's kind of like a farm to table movement almost, except that it's lab to table in this case. The tricky bit here is that it hasn't been entirely clear even now as these companies scale up production of these alternatives, what the climate impact is. So we can't just say and take it for granted, of course, it's going to be better than raising pigs and cows out in fields for the climate. They actually, a lot of times, aren't disclosing yet how much the emissions are with these processes. They're going to have to at some point. But I think a lot of them are probably waiting until they have actually scaled this up properly, because it will become economies of scale. And one day it will, of course, be better than traditional meat production, especially if you're powering all these facilities with solar power, which presumably these companies will do.
We'll be right back. On that point about the science behind what the carbon emissions are, you cite scientists who study carbon emissions, and they look at this larger idea of life cycle analysis. Can you explain what that means and why there is some doubt over that argument that cultured meat is better for the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's the scientific process, right? We can't take it as a given that this is inherently better for the environment because, as I have mentioned, this is an extremely intensive process running these labs. You have to have the meat at the right temperature. You're running it like a typical factory in a weird way, but you're churning out, animal products made from animal cells. So as I mentioned, of course, these companies are going to want to have these all on solar power. That will be probably demand from consumers who are after these products, in part because they know that it'll be eventually better for the environment than livestock out in fields. It's just a matter of scientists slowly starting to kind of peel back the mystery behind these processes. And I think that's necessarily so that these companies aren't able to share very much of it because so many of them haven't been able to scale up their production. We just don't know what the emissions will be like. But it is safe to say that, they will be pressured to use solar power to power these things. And we will one day get to a point where we are eating meat that is raised in a more sustainable and arguably a more just way.
There are also some pretty big global implications of creating lab-grown meat at scale, if it ever does get to that. And it's that reality that meat and livestock is much more than just the meat itself. It is a way of life. It's a way for people to sustain themselves, for billions of people who work in the agriculture sector, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's something that's lost here when the economically developed world are talking about these amazing technologies. They're going to revolutionize the food industry. Yes, of course, in a place like the United States, we're going to adopt these alternative meats because we want to, have less of an impact on the environment. But as you mentioned, we forget that so many billions of people rely on livestock not only for their food, but for milk. They're using it as currency. This is a way of life for so many people around the world. We can't just say, oh yeah, hey, we're going to want you all to stop raising livestock and eat this more sustainable meat because we invented it. No, so there will be at least a two-tiered system where folks continue to subsist that way. And even here in the United States, some folks will be like, well, I want to eat my meat the traditional way. That's just how I feel. Even when one day we get to the point where we can 3D print a really complex steak with all the connective tissues and all that, it'll be off-putting for some people still. So this stuff is going to be, I think, revolutionary in a certain way, but it's not going to take over the world. It will be, an alternative for quite some time in the United States. And then maybe one day it will become the norm. But I think people will still keep eating their cherished meat.
You touch on a really interesting thing there where I think, obviously, we've discussed many compelling and large-scale reasons for people to be interested in meat alternatives, or perhaps in this case, lab-grown meat. But for many people, it might be as simple as taste. Like, how do we wrap our minds around eating meat that is grown in a lab?
This is where it gets very interesting because you can be darn well sure that these companies have to absolutely nail this taste, this texture. It can't be even slightly off because I've heard folks in the industry worry about this. They talk about it like the uncanny valley of meat. Uncanny valley in robotics being where you have a humanoid robot that looks a little bit less like a human, a little bit too fake, and then it creates this dissonance in our brains. We freak out about it. Imagine that, but with the food that you're chewing in your mouth. You have to hit it dead on or it's going to freak people out and they're just going to go back to their regular meats. So, again, these companies are spending a tremendous amount of money to really, really get it right. And I think we should look to, current alternatives that have been, they're widespread at this point, like the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger, as kind of an interesting case where you don't expect them to really get it all the way right, just kind of close enough, but you know that you're eating plants and you're kind of marveling at this engineering feat that these companies have pulled off. When it comes to cultured meat or lab-grown meat, that's going to be so much more difficult. I mean, I guess with something like chorizo or sausage, which you're seeing now, or the chicken nuggets, it's, texture is mush, right? It's going to be not nearly as difficult as nailing eventually one day a 3D printed steak. It'll happen one day, probably decades down the road, but it's going to have to be absolutely perfect or you're going to tumble into that uncanny valley of meat.
Right, because as you mentioned before, creating whole muscle meat, something like a steak, is much more complex than making a sausage. We're talking about muscle fibers, we're talking about fat. It's not mush, it is a whole piece of meat that is very difficult to recreate.
Very, very difficult. And there's actually been some interesting work in labs. I think it was at MIT where they're working on what they're calling scaffolding. So it's 3D printing. I mean, it's not a one-for-one analog for what's in a steak, but it's a scaffolding kind of structure made out of edible materials like gelatin. The idea then being that you grow these cells as they're growing in labs that are now making chicken nuggets out of lab-grown meat. You grow those cells instead of in just like a bucket. That's not a technical term. They're doing it in more safe ways. But the idea being that you can kind of 3D print this scaffolding of connective tissue that we would feel in our teeth for a steak, and then grow those cells on top of it to create something like a steak. That's a long, long ways off. That's very early research, but it's actually very interesting research.
When you went to eJust's lab or kitchen, however they want to term it, did you get a chance to eat the lab-grown meat? Did they let you taste it?
I was not allowed. It was, I believe at that time, chorizo. But we went there, we actually did a video on it, and we had them cook up some of it and they ate it. I was not allowed to eat it. But I mean, obviously they have made incredible progress if they've gotten approval now in Singapore for chicken nuggets. I wasn't afraid. I just want to make that known. I'm not a coward. I would have eaten it. But maybe next time I visit.
This kind of gets to some of the claims that obviously cultured meat companies are projecting in the future. Perhaps not in the next year or 2 years or even 5 years, but further on down the road, that they see themselves as replacing conventional meat, farmed meat. Do you see that being the case? Do you think that lab-grown meat will overtake the food industry, or is it more of an accompaniment to what's already out there?
It's my belief that they're going to live side by side. I think you're going to have purists who want to eat their meat the old-fashioned way, which is a weird thing to say in 2020, but that's going to be old-fashioned soon enough. But they will live, I think, side by side. It's hard to tell which one will overtake the other and if it will stay at an equilibrium that way. But I just think there are so many people who are like, no amount of marketing is going to change their mind about this being, it's kind of weird. Let's be honest, it's strange growing meat in a lab. It's very sci-fi. And then as we had talked about earlier, there are so many people around the world that rely on livestock for so much more than just meat. It's a lofty goal that these companies are after, but I think we should temper our expectations as to how much they can penetrate this market.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate you joining to talk about it. And maybe one day down the road in the future, you and I will have a lab-grown chorizo taco somewhere out in San Francisco.
I would like that very much. Yeah, I'll track some down and just let me know when you're coming to town.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And that is Matt Simon, science reporter for Wired Magazine. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.